payments sector is in overdrive, and it's only getting faster. As our world becomes increasingly digital, companies are looking for ways to protect merchants and customers alike. Thankfully, innovative firms like Ethoca are driving the industry forward by being true payment pioneers. So I caught up with Keith Briscoe to learn more. Keith, when it comes to managing fraud, what's the biggest concern that you're hearing from card issuers and banks right now?
I think what I would say, Shannon, is that there seems to have been a shift in the last several years away from pure fraud concerns and mitigating fraud losses. Fraud is always going to be top of mind and important, there's no doubt. And banks are very, very concerned about the impact of that to their cardholders, obviously the financial impact. What I would say is happening in the industry today, though, is that there's been a shift away from purely mitigating fraud risk to enhancing the customer experience and increasing card acceptance. Because at the end of the day, every bank ultimately wants to create a great cardholder experience. That's where a lot of the focus, around key customer experience officers and those kinds of roles in the banks are evolving toward that. And I think for the most part, that's what banks are really looking at doing, is trying to streamline the overall approval process, making sure that customers can transact seamlessly, frictionlessly, remove the opportunity for any fraud when it does occur, but at the end of the day, creating a great experience both in the case of a potential dispute and downstream from that dispute through the entire purchase process. So ultimately, I think that's what banks are really focusing on, and that's, I think, also reflected in how they're prioritizing the digital channel work that they're doing. For example, the mobile banking app, the online banking statement. Banks are really gravitating more toward enriched experiences through those kinds of channels. And they also have the added benefit of removing a lot of the OpEx as well if customers can self-serve through those channels as well. So I think fraud's always going to be important, just to summarize, but customer experience is beginning to become very much front and center in that whole process.
And then on the flip side of things, where are you seeing, you talk about the client experience, but you often hear that merchants and consumers are still frustrated with the process. So what frustrations are you hearing?
Yeah, so on the cardholder side of things, whenever a fraud or a dispute incident does occur, there's a series of interactions that have to take place. If it becomes fraud, there's an investigation and a claims process that happens. That's not pleasant for cardholders to actually go through. So potentially trying to intercept the dispute before it gets to that point has become really critical. On the merchant side, of course, because a lot of these disputes are resolved via the chargeback process, that's a very painful thing for merchants as well. When it does become fraud or a dispute, there's the potential, in most cases, to lose the revenue, obviously, and in many cases, because of the high incidence of false claims or friendly fraud, merchants are actually entitled to that revenue. So there's a significant financial and customer experience impact for the merchant as well.
And obviously technology is driving these customer experience initiatives forward. Where does Ethoca sit in the ecosystem, and what pain points are you helping solve?
Yeah, so Ethoca sits square in the middle of the relationship between the card issuers and the merchants. So if you think about the current four-party model in payments where you have a cardholder, a card issuer, an acquirer, a processor, a card network, right? It's a multi-part ecosystem, and it can be often, as a result, not very efficient and not a great experience for cardholders. So Ethoca has built a direct bridge effectively between the merchant and the card issuer to allow them to exchange intelligence in real time. And what we learned was that card issuers are doing things in a vacuum, in a silo on their own, in many cases very effectively using AI technologies and great fraud models and rules and so forth. And merchants are doing the same on their end, and they're both making decisions also in a vacuum as well. So what we're enabling through our network is merchants to share that kind of intelligence that they have, and for issuers to also share that intelligence directly with merchants that they have. So it's a much more balanced ecosystem, and both parties can actually benefit from the intelligence that each has. So and the problems that this solves ultimately are in just completely eliminating fraud in the chargeback process. So if you think about the chargeback process today, it can often take 6 weeks for a merchant to even hear that there's fraud. So that's very painful, and for a merchant, there's nothing you can do at that point to stop the fraud or eliminate the chargeback. So that's one of the most tactical things we would solve for. In the case of what is our flagship product, Ethoca Alerts, that's what I'm just describing. There's also the opportunity if a card issuer calls out to their cardholder with suspicion of fraud and the cardholder confirms it, you can completely avoid that whole fraud investigations and claims process as well. So for the cardholder, that's a much better experience. Often what would happen if you called into your bank or the bank called you and you said it was fraud, the bank would credit you those funds back because you're not liable in a card not present transaction. And if a merchant does refund, there could be a refund posted against the account potentially, and then the card issuer would have to retract the credit. And so for a consumer, when you're looking at your statement and seeing all of these charges, it's really hard to reconcile all that as well. So our network helps to remove a lot of that friction and confusion from the cardholder side of that process. So that's where the customer experience dimension comes into it as well. So those are some of the key problems that we're certainly solving. Recovery of revenue, elimination of fraud risk, elimination of fraud losses, and much better customer experience.
And you mentioned you really sit in the center of that ecosystem between merchant, cardholders, card issuers, and you've recently launched a product called Ethoca Eliminator. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so Eliminator is really the next evolution of where we're taking our collaboration network. And I mentioned a little bit earlier about false claims and friendly fraud. And just so the audience understands, friendly fraud is really when a cardholder disputes a transaction that they in fact did perform, or potentially someone in their household performed. So in many cases, this could be a completely benign thing. A customer is looking at their statement, simply doesn't recognize the descriptor or the details about their purchase, so they call in and dispute it to the bank, and it's recorded as fraud, and so the typical claims process would kick in. In some cases, it's household fraud or friendly fraud, when a child on your account maybe made a purchase you weren't aware of, and you simply don't recognize it came from within your own household. And then it can kind of trend into the more nefarious ends of the spectrum, where cardholders have learned how to game the system to their own benefit. So once they understand how easy it is to get a potential credit from their issuer, right, that further emboldens them to repeat that behavior in the future. So with Eliminator, we're really, through a very rich data and API integration, allowing card issuers to effectively tap into all the order information that merchants have. So that connection has really never existed before in the industry. So how it would play out is you click on your transaction in the digital statement, a receipt would appear, and then through looking at that receipt and reviewing the transaction details, you could jog your memory and say, oh, okay, I remember actually doing that transaction. Or the alternative scenario is in the call center, you call into your bank, and the agent at the bank can actually pull up that information about the transaction and again walk you through it to help you understand that it was in fact you who performed the transaction. So what you're in fact doing with Eliminator then is preventing the dispute from even occurring. So the fraud would never get recorded. It's called a deflection in this case, where the cardholder has that aha moment and recognizes it was them. So that's the deflection that occurs with Eliminator. It benefits all sides of the ecosystem, because for a bank, primarily top of mind is customer experience. That's a transformative customer experience for a cardholder in the digital channel if they never ever have to call into their bank. And from an OpEx point of view for a bank as well, that's definitely a win. On the merchant side, when that dispute is deflected, they would recover the revenue associated with that transaction, and they also avoid the potential chargeback risk associated with it as well. So Eliminator is really the next evolution of the use cases that we're trying to solve for. But even that, I mean, we've really just begun, I think, to scratch the surface of where collaboration goes. Eliminator is definitely a step toward that future. And really, ultimately, where this is headed is something called post-transaction customer experience. So allowing the cardholder not just to recognize the transaction to avoid a dispute, but also to allow them to better engage in the bank's digital app, because every bank wants that. You know, they want the cardholder actually in their digital app, paying attention to the bank, increasing the opportunity for further services and enhancing that experience. Because there's always the alternative with a lot of the new technologies and personal finance management tools out there today, where a customer can see their aggregated accounts across all of their potential institutions. Right? Banks want to keep that native in-app experience, so they maintain a direct relationship with their cardholder. So that's really where Eliminator is now starting to head.
So to wrap up then, talk to me a little bit about the strategies behind partnering with banks and ultimately creating that great client experience.
So in the world of collaboration, the thing that really works is making sure you get both the merchant and the issuer side together as early as possible to really build out the use cases and really understand the pain points. So one thing we never do is just attempt to build a product to a set of requirements we think we understand, without actually making sure that there's a journey that we take along with our card issuers and merchants all the way through. So that usually starts with something like working group meetings that we have, where we have both sides represented. We'll get a really in-depth understanding of what the business problem actually is, and then how we can actually use our network to build a product to solve for it. And throughout the entire pilot process, at every stage of the innovation lifecycle, we're working in lockstep with them to actually go through beta tests, to have them review screens and interfaces, those kinds of things, to make sure that they think it's going to be effective. So what that does is it effectively gives us a high level of confidence once we actually get the solution to market and it's built, that it's going to actually work and be effective. So, I mean, you can understand when you build new innovations, sometimes there's no guarantee they're going to work. But this helps potentially de-risk all of that, and we've certainly seen that to be effective. And as we look at future use cases, once we have Eliminator in its base case effective, we then get back with our merchants and issuers and really start to talk about the evolution of where that heads next. I talked a little bit about that with regard to customer experience and where some of those use cases go, but there is so much more that can be done when you have rich data at the core of a real-time network like this. And where it ultimately will lead is, it would be great if merchants, once they realize the value of sharing that extended data for the purposes of resolving chargebacks and disputes, would also begin to then get comfortable with using that data for driving a better authorization experience. I mean, you probably heard of things like 3D Secure and those kinds of technologies. So those things potentially have a lot of promise if we can scale them across a lot of merchants. And that's one of the things we're aiming to do with the future of where Eliminator goes as well, is how can you actually out of the gate drive a better authorization decision, because that's happening as early as possible in the customer interaction, and that's really table stakes, right? At the end of the day, a cardholder wants their transaction to get approved. And to the extent that we can share data, intelligence, as early as possible in the transaction lifecycle, that will generate the most value for everyone in the ecosystem.
Well, the technology is certainly innovative. Keith, thank you so much for your insights.
Thanks, Shannon.
When cardholders experience less purchase friction, it results in higher satisfaction towards their banking providers. And thanks to Ethoca, it's a win-win all around. From Medici Studio, I'm Shannon Rossick.